hope you're good. So I've had about a dozen requests to cover the Yamaha CS-15, and I said if I can get hold of one, I would, and ta-da! I've got hold of one. So the CS range from the 70s contains a lot of instruments. So at the top of the pile is the CS-80, which is one of the most famous synths of all time. I was lucky enough to get a go on one of those last year, and my God, does that thing sound good. Coming down from there, you've got the 60 and the 50, which are both polys, kind of cut down versions of the CS-80. And then into the monos, the black-faced monos, you have the CS-30, CS-30L, the CS-15, the CS-10, and then the little CS-5. There's also a sister series, which has the CS-70M, CS-40M, CS-20M, and the CS-15D, I think, and possibly even more. So there's a lot of instruments in the CS range. In the mono range, which the CS-15 sits in, this is kind of in the upper middle, but there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. It's a really cool and underrated synth, and there's so much that it does that it would be a very long video to explain it. So what I'm going to do is make a bunch of sounds and then explain how I've made those sounds, which in turn should explain how the synth works. So let's go. So that first patch is all about the LFO, which I'll talk about in a second. So I've got oscillator 1 as a square wave at 64 feet. I've got oscillator 2 as a sawtooth at 32 feet, so it's up the octave. Oscillator 1 is running into mixer 1 and into filter 1, and that's in low pass mode. And then oscillator 2 and some of oscillator 1 are running into mixer 2 and into filter 2, which is in bandpass mode. Filter 1 runs into VCA 1 and filter 2 runs into VCA 2. Both filters are contoured by envelope generator 1, and both VCAs are contoured by envelope generator 2. The LFO is a sawtooth, which is pulsing away, and that is modulating the pulse width of oscillator 1, both filters, and both VCAs. So it's giving you that kind of pulsing, stuttering thing across the board. So already this should give you the idea that this synth has two completely discrete signal paths. So let's explore that with another sound. So for that sound, I've got two square waves with different pulse widths and with different amounts of pulse width modulation. And that modulation is coming from the LFO that is running so fast that it's in the audio range. The LFO on this synth has a super wide range from really slow right up into the audio range. And those are giving you a kind of oscillator distortion because the pulse width modulation is running so fast. And then those are running on into their own filters, their own VCAs, and I'm using both envelopes again. So for that sound, I was creating a kick drum and a snare drum at the same time on the CS-15. How am I doing that? Well, as well as the discrete signal paths you can set up on the CS-15, there's independent CV and trigger control on the rear of the instrument. So you can set up one sound with the top bank of the synth with independent CV and trigger control, and then you can set up a second sound along the bottom, which I've done. So for the snare sound, I've used a combination of white noise and then a square wave from oscillator 1 that's having its pulse width modulated by an audio rate LFO to give a kind of metallic sound, which I've blended in at a lower level than the white noise. It's going through its own filter, its own VCA, and being contoured by envelope generator 1. And then for the kick drum sound, I'm using VCO2 64 feet with a triangle wave, and that's running through its own filter, its own VCA, and then using envelope generator 2. And I can't think of many two-oscillator analog monosynths where you could do this. Usually they have a fixed architecture and you can make one sound at a time. So this has more in common with a modular synth than it does a fixed architecture synthesizer. So for those two examples, I was making use of the two resonant bandpass filters with different cutoff frequencies and different envelope depths. I was creating formant vowel type sounds, that kind of wow kind of thing. And that's just one of the many things you can do with multi-mode filters in parallel. So, a Ceetar sound from a synth, that's not something I've ever done before, but you can on the CS-15. So I was making use of the independent tuning of the two oscillators. I'm sure you could hear I had the second oscillator up a fifth, and then I blended that in the mixer sections. Also making use of the multi-mode filters again. But the other section I was making use of was the glide section, which I have actually been using, but I've just forgot to mention it so far. So there is portamento on this synth, and that's found in the performance section on the bottom left of the instrument, but glide is different. So portamento is about the relationship between the note you play and the note that preceded it, so it will glide between those two notes. And depending on the intervallic distance between those two notes, you'll have a different amount of portamento. The glide has nothing to do with the preceding note you've played. It is like a pre-bend or an inverted pre-bend, where the note either starts above or below the one you've played and either bends down or bends up. And using the time knob, you can set that to be very long or you can set it to be very short. And it's independent for each VCO. So at a very short setting, it acts like an envelope bending the frequency of an oscillator, which is how you create drum sounds, and it's how you create that kind of pluck sound, that initial attack, like a plectrum is just bending the string that little bit on attack. And so I was using that to create the Ceetar. So a whistling sound, because why not? It's a CS-15 and you can. So I'm making use of VCF1 in high pass mode and VCF2 in bandpass mode. Those are in parallel. VCO1, I've got that right up at 2 feet. This synth has got an insane range. It goes ridiculously high, painfully high, in fact. And so I've blended that down a bit so it's not taking your head off. And then I'm leaning more on VCO2, which is down at 4 feet. I say down at 4 feet, it's still very high. And those are being modulated by a sine wave LFO to give some vibrato. And I'm using the little pitch bender in the performance section to the bottom left for a little bit of articulation. So there's just a few examples of the Yamaha CS-15's sound capabilities. I've barely scratched the surface. There's things I haven't even talked about, like the external signal in and trigger generator. There's pretty comprehensive routing of the envelopes, positive and negative, in the filters. There's the brilliant section in the bottom corner that has discrete control of either filter or both. So there's an awful lot going on with this synth when you run your eye over it, which makes up for the things it doesn't have, like oscillator sync, or an LFO that can be re-triggered on note on, or a stereo out, or a slider to introduce LFO control in the performance section. So the final thing I'm going to do, as ever, is just make a short performance with it so we can hear it in context.